Have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped answering everyone who reached out to you? If one day you decided not to reply, not to explain, not to be available at every ring, every vibration, every whisper of your name? What if silence itself became your response? And in that silence, something inside you began to shift. Elias had never asked himself that question. Not until the morning everything in his life felt unbearably loud. His phone buzzed, his inbox filled, his messages blinked with endless urgency. Everyone wanted something from him, advice, comfort, attention, validation, and he gave it freely, almost compulsively. It made him feel needed, relevant, alive. But somewhere, deep beneath that comfort, something darker stirred. A faint, gnawing voice that whispered, "You are not being loved. You are being used." He didn't want to believe it. He had built his entire identity around being available, the dependable friend, the listener, the problem solver. Yet every time he hung up, every time he sent another reassuring text, a quiet resentment pooled in his chest. He couldn't explain it. It wasn't anger at others. It was anger at himself. For giving too much. For being so easy to reach. That morning, when the sunlight filtered through his blinds in streaks of gold and gray, Elias felt something inside him finally fracture. The sound of notifications, once harmless, now pierced through him like glass. He turned his phone face down, but the vibration continued, an invisible chain tugging him back into the same exhausting rhythm. He sat there, motionless, staring at the silent device on the table. And then, without ceremony, without any grand decision, he turned it off. For the first time in years, silence filled the room. No buzzing, no ringing, no digital heartbeat demanding his attention. Just the sound of his own breathing, raw and uneven. And in that silence, something strange began to happen. At first, he felt panic. His mind raced with imagined emergencies. Someone might need him. Someone might be hurt. Someone might think he doesn't care. The anxiety pressed against his ribs like a fist. But then, slowly, another feeling crept in. A lightness. A sense of distance he hadn't felt in years. The silence became not an absence, but a presence. A quiet observer in the corner of the room, watching him. For the rest of the day, Elias didn't turn his phone back on. He wandered aimlessly through his apartment, noticing things he had long ignored. The faint ticking of the clock, the smell of coffee grounds on the counter, the way dust floated lazily in the afternoon light. The world, it seemed, had been waiting for him to stop talking so it could speak. By evening, the panic had subsided. In its place was a deep, unfamiliar stillness, like standing on the edge of a vast, dark lake. He didn't know whether to fear it or surrender to it. And then came the thought that would haunt him for nights to come. If I disappear, who will notice and who will simply move on? It wasn't a cry for attention. It was a realization, a small, brutal truth peeling itself open inside him. That being constantly reachable had made him invisible in a different way. He had become background noise in the lives of others. Always there, always available, always forgotten the moment he was silent. That night, he lay in bed with the phone still off, the room wrapped in darkness and quiet. Somewhere deep within, something began to wake. Something he had long buried beneath the noise of constant connection. It wasn't peace. It wasn't fear. It was awareness. And awareness, as Carl Jung once wrote, is the beginning of transformation. Elias didn't yet know it, but by choosing silence, he had already set something in motion that could never be undone. Have you ever noticed how the moment you stop chasing people, they suddenly start wondering where you went? How silence, when unexpected, can make more noise than words ever could. Elias didn't plan to test that theory. He only wanted peace. A day, maybe two, of quiet. But by the third morning, when his phone remained dark and still, the world began to react. Friends texted first in curiosity, then in concern. Some called multiple times, leaving voicemails that blended apology with annoyance. "Where are you, man?" one message said. "You can't just vanish like that." The irony was painful. He had been there for them every single time they needed him. But now, when he needed space, they treated his absence like an offense. It was as if his silence exposed something they didn't want to face, that their connection depended not on mutual care, but on his constant availability. He watched the notifications pile up without opening them. Each one felt like a test of his resolve. The urge to reply pulsed in his fingertips. It would be so easy to respond, to step back into that familiar cycle of comfort and validation. But something inside him whispered, "Don't. Let them feel your absence. Let them see what you were giving all along." The first real shift came from Mira, his closest friend, or so he thought. She had always been the one calling at midnight, pouring her chaos into his ear while he listened patiently. She had never once asked how he was doing. Now, her messages carried a different tone. Sharper, colder. "You've changed. You're acting strange. If you don't want to talk, just say it." Elias almost laughed at the irony. He was saying it with silence. But few people can hear silence when it speaks truth. Most only hear rejection. Days passed. The world outside moved on, but Elias began to move inward. Without the constant noise of others, he started noticing the noise within himself. The doubts, the insecurities, the unspoken anger. He realized how long he had lived disconnected from his own needs, mistaking servitude for love. There was a strange beauty in that realization, like meeting himself for the first time. He started journaling again, writing thoughts that scared him. Why am I so afraid to be forgotten? Why do I measure my worth through others? Why do I confuse being needed with being loved? The silence around him deepened. Some people drifted away completely, no goodbye, no closure. Others lingered, confused by his change, trying to provoke a reaction. But Elias didn't bite. The more distant he became, the clearer he saw who truly cared and who simply depended on his availability to fill their own emptiness. And here's where it gets interesting. When he stopped reaching out, the energy of his entire life began to shift. People who once took him for granted began to wonder. Some even grew curious, drawn by the quiet confidence that was replacing his old desperation. That's the strange magic of detachment. When you stop begging for connection, the world starts chasing your mystery. And before we move further, let me tell you this. If you've ever felt drained by giving too much, if you've ever wondered what would happen if you stopped being so easy to reach, then stay until the very end of this story. Because what happens next is what changes everything. Elias was about to discover that silence doesn't just reveal others. It transforms you. And that transformation comes with a price. Have you ever realized that silence is not the absence of noise, but the presence of everything you've been avoiding? That when the world goes quiet, your own mind becomes deafening. Elias was learning that lesson the hard way. It had been nearly 2 weeks since he turned off his phone. The panic that once ruled his mornings had faded, replaced by an odd, still rhythm, like walking through fog, where the world is muffled but strangely alive. He no longer reached for validation in the glow of screens or in the voices of others. Yet, in the depth of that calm, something unsettling began to stir, the echo of his own unhealed self. Without the distraction of people, his mind turned inward. He began to hear thoughts he had long silenced. Regrets whispered like ghosts through the corners of his memory. Missed chances, fake smiles, words he had swallowed instead of speaking. The silence, once peaceful, now felt alive, intelligent, probing, relentless. He started to dream differently too. In one dream, he stood before a door that wouldn't open no matter how hard he pushed. On the other side, he could hear a faint tapping, as if someone or something was waiting. When he woke, his pulse raced, his body trembling. The dream felt less like imagination and more like a message. But from who? Days merged into nights. Elias began writing again, but the words that spilled from him didn't feel entirely his own. They came from some deeper place, sharp and raw, speaking truths he wasn't ready to face. He wrote, "The self you show the world is only half of who you are. The rest waits behind the silence, watching, waiting for you to acknowledge it." He didn't remember writing those words, yet there they were, in his own handwriting. It was as if another version of him had taken over the pen, a version that had been waiting patiently all along. And that's when he began to feel it, the presence. It wasn't supernatural. It was psychological. But it was real enough to make the hairs on his arms rise. He felt watched, not by others, but by something within him. A darker consciousness that seemed to grow stronger with every day of isolation. Carl Jung would have called it the shadow, the part of the psyche that hides everything we deny, fear, or suppress. Elias didn't know that term yet, but he was starting to understand its truth. He began to see flashes of his reflection in strange ways, distorted in mirrors, distant in windows, like the version of himself that used to exist was no longer the same. He noticed small details, the intensity in his eyes, the quiet confidence replacing his old neediness. The world had not changed, but he had. And people could feel it too. When he finally stepped outside after 2 weeks, neighbors greeted him differently. Their smiles lingered a second longer, their eyes uncertain. They couldn't name it, but they sensed something about him had shifted. A gravity, a self-contained energy that pulled and repelled at once. That's the paradox of becoming unavailable. You lose some people, but you gain a power that others can't quite understand. That night, Elias sat in the dark again, staring at the turned-off phone beside him. He no longer feared missing a call. He feared something else now, that in becoming untouchable, he was awakening something ancient, something buried deep beneath the layers of who he thought he was. He whispered to himself, maybe this is what happens when you finally stop running. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning, because the silence wasn't done with him yet. Have you ever wondered what would happen if you spent enough time alone to truly meet yourself? Not the version you show the world, but the one that hides beneath your smiles, your habits, and your need to be liked. Elias was about to find out. By the 3rd week, his solitude had become more than an experiment. It was an awakening. The quiet no longer felt empty. It was full, vibrating with unspoken truths. Yet, the deeper he sank into silence, the clearer he heard something that didn't belong to the ordinary noise of thought. A voice, faint at first, like an echo under his breath. It wasn't madness. It was familiar, intimate. It sounded like him, but not the him he knew. It began during one of his nightly reflections. He sat cross-legged in the dim light of a single candle, journaling as he had every night. He wrote slowly, carefully, thoughts about how peace felt, how detachment had given him strength. But when he looked down at the page, the last line wasn't one he remembered writing. You don't want peace. You want control. Elias froze. The pen dropped from his hand. His breath caught in his throat. He couldn't recall writing it. Yet the ink was fresh, the handwriting perfect. For a long time, he just stared at it, feeling something cold unfurl in his chest. That night, sleep wouldn't come. When he closed his eyes, he felt the presence again. That same awareness, that same pressure in the room, like the air itself was alive and listening. He sat up, whispered into the darkness. Who are you? And in the thick silence that followed, the answer came, not in words but in knowing. It was him, the part of himself that had never spoken before. The one he had buried beneath years of people-pleasing, compliance, and fear. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Elias didn't know that quote, but he was living it. Every suppressed feeling, every silenced truth, every unspoken no he'd swallowed was now returning, given form and voice in the darkness of his solitude. He started talking to it, the voice, the shadow, the unseen companion within. At first, their conversations were small, reflective. I only wanted peace, Elias would say, and the voice would reply, peace without truth is just numbness. Each exchange stripped away a layer of illusion. He began to see how much of his life had been built around keeping others comfortable, even at the cost of his own sanity. How every yes had been a small betrayal of himself. But with awareness came danger. The voice grew bolder, sharper, testing him. Why do you think people called you when they needed comfort? It whispered one night. Because you were easy, predictable. You gave everything and asked for nothing. They loved that about you. But they never loved you. Elias wanted to deny it, but he couldn't. The words hit with surgical precision. He had always known this truth. Only now, there was no noise left to drown it out. He began to wonder if maybe the real prison had never been other people's expectations, but his own refusal to set himself free. One evening, he stood before the mirror again. The candlelight flickered, casting twin shadows on the wall, his and something else just beside it. For a moment, it looked as if his reflection smiled before he did. He whispered, half afraid, half in awe, "Are you me?" And from somewhere deep within the silence came the answer he both dreaded and desired. "I've always been." He felt a shiver crawl up his spine. The voice wasn't his enemy. It was his equal, the balance he had spent his whole life avoiding. That night, for the first time, Elias didn't try to silence the voice. He listened. He accepted. And with that acceptance came something terrifyingly liberating, the realization that true transformation doesn't come from becoming someone new, but from facing who you've always been. Have you ever reached a point where the world you once knew stops making sense? Where every familiar face feels distant, and even your own reflection looks like a stranger? Elias had reached that point. It had been over a month since he withdrew from everyone. The silence that once terrified him had become his sanctuary. But now that stillness was beginning to show its cracks. He was changing, deeply, quietly, and in ways that couldn't be unseen. The more he faced his shadow, the more the outer world began to distort, mirroring his transformation in strange, unsettling ways. When he finally turned his phone back on, the screen exploded with messages. Hundreds of unread notifications, unanswered calls, emails stacked like accusations. But what startled him most wasn't the number, it was the tone. The same people who once demanded his attention now wrote differently. Their words carried hesitance, uncertainty, even guilt. "I didn't realize how much I leaned on you. You okay? I miss how easy it was to talk to you. You've gone quiet. Feels weird without you." He scrolled through them, emotionless. It wasn't pride or anger he felt. It was distance, detachment. He could see, with painful clarity, how every relationship in his life had been shaped by his need to please. And now that need was gone. That's the paradox of inner change. When you stop living for others, you start to see them for who they truly are. When he returned to work, his colleagues noticed it immediately. Elias spoke less, but when he did, people listened. His presence, once soft and accommodating, now carried weight. He didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't seek approval. And that quiet confidence unsettled some of them. The ones who had thrived on his compliance began to avoid him. Others, curious and drawn to his calm, came closer. Mira was one of them. The friend who once filled his silence with her chaos now approached him differently. Cautiously, almost respectfully. "You've changed," she said again one evening, her voice softer this time. "I finally stopped pretending," Elias replied. She looked at him, searching for the old version. The one who would listen endlessly, reassure her, make her feel important. But that man was gone. What remained was something steadier, stronger, but less comforting. She smiled weakly. "You're harder to reach now." Elias nodded. "Good." That single word carried the weight of everything he had learned, about boundaries, self-respect, and the cost of being too available. For the first time, he didn't feel guilty for choosing himself, but with that liberation came a new unease. Because the more Elias reclaimed his voice, the more he realized how easily the world feeds on those who don't have one. The energy of his life shifted again, subtly, eerily. People responded to him differently. Some admired his peace. Others felt threatened by it. And at night, when he was alone, the silence began to take on a new form. Less as an echo, more as a companion. He would sit in the dark, feeling both entirely alone and completely whole. The voice, the shadow, no longer spoke to him as before. It didn't need to. His work was done. It had been integrated, absorbed, made conscious. Yet, sometimes he could still sense it. A faint murmur just beyond his thoughts, reminding him how close he had come to losing himself before he finally found his truth. He started to understand something profound. Most people fear loneliness not because they don't want to be alone, but because they're afraid of meeting the parts of themselves they've abandoned. Elias had met those parts, and now they walked with him. The mirror hadn't just reflected him anymore. It had shattered, revealing what lay beneath the surface. And through those cracks, light began to pour in. Have you ever realized that true transformation doesn't come from what you gain, but from what you lose along the way? Elias was learning that every rebirth demands a sacrifice. It had been nearly 2 months since he disappeared from the noise of the world. His silence had become both shield and mirror, forcing him to confront every version of himself. The obedient, the fearful, the unseen. But transformation is rarely gentle. It breaks before it rebuilds. One morning, Elias received an email. It was from his employer, a polite but final notice. His prolonged absence, his withdrawal from team culture, had been labeled uncooperative. He was being let go. He read the message slowly. There was no anger, no sadness, only a strange sense of detachment. The man who once sought validation in others' approval didn't feel wounded anymore. He felt free. Still, the silence that followed was heavier than before. Losing his job meant losing the last tether to his old identity. The dependable one, the reliable one, the person everyone could count on. Without that mask, what remained? That night, as he sat in his small apartment surrounded by candlelight, Elias thought about the voice he had once feared, the shadow. It had stopped speaking weeks ago, but he could still feel its presence, calm and grounded within him. It wasn't a haunting now, it was a partnership, a unity between who he had pretended to be and who he truly was. Yet, the world outside was not so accepting of this change. Old friends who had once crowded his life now reached out less. When they did, the conversations felt forced. Some couldn't understand why he had chosen distance. Others accused him of becoming cold. One even said, "You think you're better than us now." He didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply said, "I've stopped needing to be understood." And that was the truth. Because understanding, he realized, often requires others to see your pain, and most people aren't ready to look that deeply. But while detachment brought peace, it also brought a quiet kind of loneliness. Nights stretched long and silent. The stillness he once cherished now carried the faint ache of isolation. It was in that fragile balance between peace and solitude that Elias began to truly see the cost of awakening. Freedom, he discovered, is not comfortable. It is raw. It strips away the false layers of belonging and leaves you standing alone in your truth. He spent hours writing again, not to be heard, but to understand. His notebooks filled with thoughts that blurred the line between philosophy and confession. When you stop chasing others, you start to meet yourself. But when you meet yourself, you realize how few people ever really knew you. As the days passed, Elias noticed how differently he moved through the world. The small irritations that once consumed him, the rush of traffic, the demands of people, the weight of expectation, no longer touched him the same way. He had stopped reacting. He had started observing. It wasn't indifference. It was awareness. And yet, in this clarity, he began to sense a final challenge approaching, a kind of reckoning between who he used to be and the life he was meant to live. Change always demands one last confrontation. The universe tests you to see if you've truly learned the lesson. For Elias, that test would come not from within, but from someone who once defined his old self. A message appeared one evening, unexpected and simple. From Mira. "Can we talk?" He stared at the words for a long time. It felt like the past reaching out one final time, asking for a response. But the man holding the phone was no longer the one who used to answer instantly. He knew this moment mattered, not because of what she wanted, but because of what it represented. The choice between returning to who he was, or continuing to become who he was meant to be. He took a deep breath. And in that breath, every lesson, every silence, every shadow he had faced gathered within him. His finger hovered over the screen, hesitating, trembling, then steady. Whatever he chose next would define everything. Have you ever had a moment when the past knocks on your door, asking to be let back in, just when you finally learned to live without it? Elias was standing at that door now. The message from Mira sat glowing on his phone. "Can we talk?" Just 4 words, but they carried the weight of his old life. of the version of him that had once said yes to everything, afraid that silence might make him disappear. He stared at the screen for a long time, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. His instinct, the old reflex, was to reply immediately to bridge the distance to comfort. But another part of him, the part he had fought to uncover, whispered softly, "You owe no one your peace." Still, curiosity tugged at him. He typed one word, "Okay." They met in a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place where the hum of conversation hides private confessions. When Mira walked in, Elias could see surprise flicker in her eyes. He looked different, calm, grounded, distant in a way that unsettled her. She smiled, tentative. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "I almost didn't," he said simply. There was an awkward pause before she spoke again. "You've really changed." Elias looked at her, searching her face for traces of the old dynamic. The dependency, the emotional weight she used to unload onto him, it wasn't there now. Or maybe it was, but he no longer carried it. "I stopped being available all the time," he said. "Turns out people treat you differently when you stop saving them." Myra's eyes softened with a hint of guilt. "I know. I took advantage of that, didn't I?" He didn't answer. Silence filled the space between them like a mirror reflecting truth. Finally, she said, "I just miss how things used to be." Elias smiled faintly. "You don't miss me, Mira. You miss how I made you feel." The honesty hung in the air, sharp and gentle at once. She looked down, blinking fast, realizing he was right. For years, she had relied on him to absorb her chaos, to make her feel steady without ever offering him the same in return. But Elias wasn't angry anymore. He had moved beyond resentment. What he felt was clarity, an understanding that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's self-erasure. They talked for a while longer, but the conversation drifted like smoke, aimless, fading. She tried to rekindle the connection, to find the version of him who once filled every silence with reassurance. But that version was gone, and the man sitting before her had no desire to resurrect him. Eventually, Mira sighed. "You really are different now. It's like you don't need anyone." Elias thought for a moment, then replied, "Needing people isn't the problem. Needing their approval is." And that was the moment he knew the test was over. The universe had sent the past to see if he would bend. But he didn't. He didn't lash out, didn't retreat into guilt, didn't chase old comfort. He simply stood in his truth, calm, whole, untouchable. When they parted, there were no promises, no goodbyes. Just an unspoken understanding that some connections exist only to teach you where to draw the line. Elias walked home as the evening light bled into gold. The city pulsed around him, alive with noise and motion, yet he felt profoundly still inside. It wasn't isolation anymore. It was mastery, the kind of peace that no one could take from him. He realized then what Carl Jung meant when he said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakes." For the first time in his life, Elias was truly awake. He reached home, turned off his phone again, and set it aside, not as an act of rebellion, but of freedom. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was alive. It hummed with power, with truth, with everything he had found within himself. He sat in that silence, smiling to no one in particular. He had faced the world, faced the shadow, and faced the echo of his old self, and he had not flinched. He understood now, when you stop being so easy to reach, you don't lose people. You lose illusions, and in losing them, you finally find yourself. Have you ever noticed that the most powerful changes in life happen quietly? Without applause, without announcement, without anyone even realizing they've taken place? Elias's transformation had been exactly that, silent, steady, and irreversible. Weeks had passed since his meeting with Mira. The echoes of his old life had grown faint, like voices fading at the edge of a dream. The urgency of connection, the hunger to be understood, those impulses had dissolved, replaced by something far deeper. Contentment. It wasn't the kind of contentment that came from happiness or success. It was the peace of knowing who he was when no one was watching. Each morning, Elias woke before sunrise and sat by the window, watching the world come alive in slow motion. the city's distant hum, the pale blue light spreading across rooftops. It all felt new, as if he were seeing life for the first time, stripped of distortion. He no longer needed noise to feel alive. Silence had become his language. Solitude had become his companion. But he hadn't vanished from the world. He had simply changed how he existed within it. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried weight. He gave less, but what he gave had meaning. And slowly, without trying, the right kind of people began to drift toward him. The ones who valued depth over attention, presence over performance. His transformation hadn't pushed the world away. It had filtered it. One evening, as Elias walked home through the quiet streets, a thought surfaced, clear and calm. You were never meant to be reachable by everyone. He realized then that his whole life had been built on accessibility, emotional, mental, digital. Always available, always ready to serve, to fix, to listen. But when you are too reachable, people stop reaching inward. They use you as a bridge to avoid their own silence. And in cutting those bridges, Elias hadn't become cold. He had become whole. He understood now what the shadow had been trying to teach him all along. That self-discovery isn't about changing who you are, but reclaiming the parts you gave away. As night fell, Elias stood before the mirror one last time. His reflection looked back at him, not as a stranger, not as a distortion, but as an equal. He smiled, quietly. There was no tension in his face, no performance in his posture, just presence. He whispered, "We're here." And for the first time, the silence answered not as an echo, but as unity. He thought about the people still trapped in the noise, the ones who gave too much, who bent too easily, who mistook being needed for being loved. He wished he could tell them what he had learned. That when you stop being so easy to reach, everything changes, not because others fade, but because you finally appear. And that appearance, raw, unfiltered, unapologetic, is the beginning of real power. Elias turned away from the mirror, lit a candle, and sat in its soft glow. He didn't need answers anymore. The questions themselves were enough. Life had become a conversation between his soul and his silence. Outside, the world moved as it always had, busy, restless, loud. But inside, Elias sat unmoved, grounded in the simplest, most profound truth. That peace isn't found in being seen or heard. It's found in being whole. And as the flame flickered before him, casting long shadows against the wall, Elias smiled. He had finally learned to stop chasing connection, and instead to become it.